In about 1960, we had a party. We were living in Winchester, Massachusetts at the time, and Marvin Minsky and his wife Gloria came with their daughter Margaret, and they brought along a friend, and that friend was John Cocke. And that's when I first met John Cocke, at least as near as I can remember. And it was quite an interesting experience because John told me lots of things, and I was quite taken by him, I would say, because the things he told me were so interesting. And he was obviously very much enamored with good ideas and liked to talk about them, and I like to listen. So that started a friendship that's lasted all this time. Conversations with John covered a lot of different areas, but the focal point was almost always computers and technical issues about computers, although sometimes we'd be talking about flying or skiing or, you know, other kinds of things like that. But basically, things usually started out with computers, I would say that, and ideas in the computer field. Well, of course, I think of him as an architect, and I think that he's an architect who brings a lot to bear, a lot of knowledge to bear on the problem of how do you make a better computer system. He's good and knowledgeable in areas ranging from mathematics to software and so on. And of course, it's the combination of those interests, I think, that is one of his greatest strengths. The people who came to that party, I remember some of the other people. I think John McCarthy was there, and I can't remember all because this was a long time ago, but there were some very, very bright people. These were probably the brightest people in the computer field from one point of view, which is the point of view of artificial intelligence and what you could do with software and things like that. And what I remember is that John, this was like a galaxy of stars, if you will, and John was clearly a star, very different than all of the others, as each one of them was different from each other. But he clearly fit right in with this sort of high-powered company. And he was, I don't know, just the feeling that people that I know that know John have always felt sort of affectionate towards him because he's such a good guy in general, and so driven by his intellectual interests that he, you know, I've never known him to say or have a bad thought. When I first met John at this party, the other people there were people like John McCarthy and Marvin Minsky, other people in the computer field, and it was clear that John fit right into that company, sort of a stellar group of computer people. And the one thing that I noticed right off was that these people had what I would describe as very affectionate feelings towards John. John was just a great guy, someone whom they were anxious that I should get to know. And the point is that when you get to know John, you realize that he doesn't have a bad bone in his body, and he's tremendously interested in things, and that interest is just different than other people's level of interest. So he turns out to be a person, I don't know anyone else I would compare to him, really. Yes, I'd heard of him because John had, I think he was working on Stretch, or this might have been before Stretch even. He was keen on ideas of faster ways to build divide circuits and ways to solve the problem of slow memory access in terms of different computers, and he was always interested in what the latest ideas that were coming along and how they'd affect things and how they could be incorporated into making computers run better, that kind of thing. So back then, much as today, John was sort of full of the computer life, the intellectual set of ideas that lead to the advances that are coming down the road. Well, I've always been very interested in computer architecture, and I'm not a professional architect, but I've designed computers from time to time, and been interested in the ideas associated with them. Taught a course at M.I.T. in computer architecture, a graduate course, and so I found that the ideas that John would tell me about, I would find very interesting. In other words, I would understand them, and we sort of would easily resonate. In other words, if he would tell me something, I could understand what context it fit into and why these were very interesting ideas. And we would bounce them around and argue about things and that kind of thing. So it was a good give and take. Well, I never really got into what other people would notice as an argument. It would be sort of that there'd be a minor competition. If he tells me so many good ideas, I would feel I had to tell him some good ideas too. And there would be this kind of bouncing ideas back and forth. I mean, there's this typical experience that I have, which is it's the middle of some particular time, there's nothing going on, I'm at home, the phone rings, and it's John, and there would start about an hour, at least an hour's conversation, often starting out focused in some area, but ranging to various things and that kind of thing. So that's kind of a treasured experience. Someone once said to me they were looking at something to do with secret or classified things where it says something about a need to know. I guess if you have a secret clearance, that's not enough. You're not to be told any secrets unless you have a need to know in the military or something like that. And this person said to me, gee, John has a need to tell. And I was sort of offended by that because he does want to talk about his ideas, but I always found it a two-way street and tremendously exciting experience to have him phone up and talk. People would wonder I would have dropped out of whatever I was doing for a long time, but I think John is a much more sensitive person about other people than most people realize. One of the kinds of things he talked to me a lot about is other people. He used to tell me there's a small group of people, and he used to tell me stories about them all the time. One example is Sullivan Campbell. Sullivan Campbell went off on a great adventure. I guess he went to Xerox, and then he started a company and so on. And at one point, he was involved in an auto accident, and he broke his leg. And I got blow-by-blow descriptions of John, of Sullivan's whole career for some reason. And particularly when he broke his leg, John told me all the details, how he broke his leg and how he was in the hospital, and John visited him in the hospital and what they talked about and all those things. And then Campbell got a pulmonary embolism in the hospital and died. What was interesting is that a few years ago, I broke my leg in a way very much the way Sullivan Campbell broke his leg, and I spent a lot of time in a hospital too. And I decided I better read up on pulmonary embolisms, and I discovered that if you have one, that's very dangerous, and if you have a second one, half the people who have the second one die. So I understood why, Campbell was at some risk. And then what happened is, I did have a pulmonary embolism, and then I had a second one, but I felt perfectly safe the whole time because of the two of us, Sullivan Campbell had already died, as John Cocke told me. So I felt the odds were more in my favor, as it turned out. So,
there's a story.
Here's the story. The other thing I can tell about John is that he's made a big impression on children too. Like my son Michael has had a lot of interesting experiences with John, and John had an unusual educational experience as a child. I don't know if this has been covered, but one of my favorite John Cocke stories goes like this. I had visited him at Yorktown, which done many times, and for some reason I don't remember, I was going back into Manhattan, and John offered to give me a ride back into Manhattan. So we're driving into downtown Manhattan, and we come to a stop at a signal. And suddenly John starts honking the horn of the car. He goes, honk, honk, and I'm thinking, what's going on? And I see he's looking out the window and looking across the street, and there's a phone booth, and there's a man in the phone booth. And John's honking and waving, hey, so-and-so, and he's honking, honking. And this guy who's on the phone finally realizes all this noise has to do with him. And he came out of the phone booth holding onto the phone, and he's looking over very puzzled, what's going on? And John is saying, hey, it's me, John Cocke, you know, and the guy goes, sort of astonished look and so on, they wave, and then we drive off. John said, that was so-and-so, you know. I can't remember exactly what he said. It was either, I haven't seen him since high school or a freshman in college, or something like that. Namely, haven't seen him in 40 years since we were kids. And he recognized him in this phone booth, which struck me as impossible. And that was sort of a typical kind of John Cocke story. There's an intellectual idea in the computer field, in computer architecture, called a risk architecture. A risk architecture is one that, I'll give you my own view, which may be different than other people's, which is that the stage of technology we're at, which is we can make integrated circuits of a certain size, and if you have a chip of a certain size, you have some real estate like, and the question is, what are you going to devote it to? And the way computers started out is they started out devoting it to a very simple kind of microprocessor and having a read-only memory that held microcode, and through that you implemented a complex instruction set architecture. That's the way things went down that path. Now, in the earliest days of computers, or the earlier days, when you had a complex instruction set architecture, you didn't implement it with microcode. You implemented it directly with what you might call random logic. And then things went down this particular path of using microcode. Now, I started a business at one point, and my business was located in an old mill in Maynard. And you can't even tell a John Cocke story without having another John Cocke story within the story, so this is like that. John Cocke came to visit me there, and he got fascinated by the computer I was using, a Digital Equipment Corporation PDP-1, the very first computer they made. And I remember I sat down and explained to him exactly how this computer worked and so on, and what its architecture was, and he was really interested in that. So, not long after that, I got a phone call from John, and he said, I've been talking to my father, and I was telling him about the visit to your company, and in the old mill and so on, and then my father said to me, that mill sounds familiar, tell me more about it. So John said, I started to describe more about the mill and so on and so forth, and my father said, I'll bet that's the old American Woolen Company mill, which it was, which was one of the largest mills in the world. I think it's like 3 million square feet. So they figured out, yes, that was the American Woolen Company, and John said, my father said, I used to own it. So I thought that was funny. So anyway, that's a thing, an event that happened, and it sort of got filed away, and that's the end of that. Many years later, I get one of those John Cocke phone calls, and John says, remember that PDP-1? And I said, yes. And he said, you remember a very simple thing, and he knew all the details of it, which was interesting, because he just heard it once. And he says, and particularly, remember it had a multiply step and a divide step instruction. These were peculiar little shortcut to keep the hardware very simple. And I said, yeah. He says, well, guess what I've figured out? said, I figured out that you can make a 16-bit kind of thing, and I've got a jazzed up multiply step and divide step that take one cycle and it does 2 bits at a time and in 8 steps. It takes care of it and the numbers are in 2's complement, and because of that it does the thing with the signs done properly. And he told me all these technical facts, and he said the damn thing can emulate the whole 360 line as it was or whatever in real time. And you know, and he described architectures that he thought he could build that would be, you know, very fast using this thing. And that was basically, that was RISC architecture being invented. And what John did is, see, the RISC architecture in some funny sense was around. The PDP-1 was a RISC machine, okay, if you like. But what John did is he was the first one to realize that this idea, its time had come, as it were. And he realized it long in advance of other people. My own personal feeling is this is a kind of architecture whose time is limited, in that as we get to the point where where we can put much more stuff on a chip, then we will go to random logic complex instruction sets, which are better than either RISC or you know, microprogrammed, in my opinion at least. But in any case, this phase is, as you know, taken hold in the whole industry and is the basis of lots of successful computer designs. So that's my recollection of how it got started. Well, he wasn't always. He was. I mean, obviously, before the project started, he had to have the idea for the project, for the architecture. Oh, I don't know. I think that I think when he talked to me about it, he had in mind that they would start a project. Yeah, the 801 project was really a seminal event. Part of it had to do with not just the architecture of the machine, but the division of the load of dealing with problems between a compiler and the computer. That was a very major concept. Many people, many architects have long felt that all problems had to be solved in the hardware, and because who knows what kind of software someone might write. And John has always been a bit more rational about that and say, we can decide that there are things that won't work in the hardware, but the architecture of the software system can deal with that. And he was always, I remember, very enamored of ideas along that line. When the Motorola 68000 first came out, it had a kind of weird problem that caused lots of troubles for people like Apollo and other companies that were using it. And I remember one phone call I got where John was all enthusiastic about a really clever software fix that someone had thought of that allowed you in the compiler to get around this particular problem in an unusual way. And you know, things like that were very important, because if you were a diehard and you said, no, the hardware has to stand on its own feet and never do anything wrong, then you were really limiting yourself and ruling out lots of potential opportunities. And John was very quick to understand that if you could put your arms around the whole thing and say, look, someone's going to write some high-level software, and there can be a layer of software that takes into account certain unusual constraints of the hardware, then that whole thing could work very well. I remember one time John called me up to tell me his theory of dreams. And when he first told me this, I thought, boy, there's a strange theory if I ever heard one. But I have been interested in what he told me ever since. And this has to be, it's hard for me to tell you how long ago, but it's probably 20, 25 years ago. And I'm now convinced that his theory of dreams is correct, and it's the only correct theory of dreams. And as near as I know, I don't know anyone who knows it other than him and whomever else he's told, like me. But it's a very beautiful theory, and it takes into account, it's really a theory based on what might be called, I wouldn't call it exactly information theory, but sort of information science, the knowledge we have about information and how things are coded and how things can be interpreted. I mean interpreted in sort of a technical computer sense. What his theory was, as is typical, I believe this theory was told to me in the middle of the night, but John described the following concept. Imagine that the way our memories work is that they're efficient. And what's known from information theory is that if you have taken some set of information and attempted to encode it in the most efficient way, that if you have succeeded, then the bits you get have from your encoding scheme are indistinguishable from a random sequence of bits. Okay. And the reason for that is a very simple thing. If the bits came out all like this, 1 1 1 1 1 0 0 0 0 1 1 1 1 1, then obviously it could have been encoded more efficiently. You could say there's there's 5 ones in a row, then 5, you know, in other words, if there's all kinds of patterns to it, then it can be reduced in size by being further encoded. So this is a hallmark from sort of information science of something that has been well encoded, compressed, or condensed. So if the brain worked efficiently, then the following thing is true, that the things that go into our memory, if you could look at them with some kind of magic magnifying glass, like the developer they put on magnetic tape to see the actual little magnetic signals, would look random. Okay, so that's an interesting thought. That's just applying the ideas from sort of information theory and computer science to what might go into your brain. But then what John did is he took sort of an amazing leap and asked the reverse question, which was, if you took a truly random sequence and fed it into the decoder, what would you get? Now this is a very interesting question, because what that says is, say I remember experience I had. The experience was that I went somewheres, I went on a vacation, I went to a lake, I got a sailboat, I sailed around, there was a thunderstorm, I came back. Say I have some kind of thing like that. This is all compacted into these random bits. Well, when they're interpreted, the mind has a decoding scheme, is the idea. So to be efficient, it would have to refer to a logical sequence of things. By that I mean, if it says I went to a lake and then I did, well, what should happen is, the choices are, you went swimming, you went boating, you went sailing, you know, there's only a small number of choices. It's not an infinite number. So if you only have a small number like 5, 1 through 5, then 1 might mean I went sailing, 2 might, and so on. So those things have to do with what is possible and what's possible for you, and has to do with your other memories and so on. So suddenly John asked the question, what if I fed in a truly random sequence of bits to the decoder? What would you get? Well, the answer is you would get a completely plausible sequence of events, since each choice, as interpreting them, is only selected from plausible events that have to do with you, but it wouldn't correspond to anything in the big story. And in fact, it would manufacture a dream. So the idea is, if the source of the information is random noise, but it's fed into the memory decoding mechanism that works efficiently, then what you get exactly matches what a dream is. Okay, I think this is a very significant discovery of his. And in other words, to me, it's about as important as almost any psychological theory I've ever seen. It makes all of the Freudian analysis of dreams fall into a totally different perspective, where what you learn is what were the categories that might have been selected that have to do with the personality, but which ones were ends up just being some random noise or something like that. So, to me it fits in with every aspect of dreams. For instance, when you're dreaming and something happens in the real world, like the telephone is ringing, this stimulus is often encoded in your dream. You dream that there's a phone ringing and so on and so forth. Well, that works perfectly with this scheme, because if there's a phone ringing and your ear is hearing it, then it becomes one of the logical things to be tapped by whatever number comes up. The only question is, which context is it? If there is a phone ringing, the next thought has to be there's a phone ringing, but the random number tells you there's a phone ringing and you're going to ignore it, but someone else is going to answer, or various things like that. So my own, having thought about this for the maybe 20 years since I've heard about it, I've concluded that this is the best work on the subject that's been done so far by anyone. And I know it's not published or anything, and I'm convinced it's a great thing. Someone ought to write it up, or John should, maybe. So that's the theory of dreams. John one day told me a story about a pocket watch, and he showed me this pocket watch, a very wonderful watch called a minute repeater. There was a button on it you could push, and it would tell you the time by bonging. Even though this little pocket watch would go, say it was 3:45. Wait, no, let's make it 3:48. If it's 3:48 and you press the button, it would go bong, bong, bong. That was 3 o'clock. Then it would go bing, bing, bing. That was for 15-minute ones. So, you know, it was 3/4 past the hour, and then go ding, ding, ding. That was for the 3 minutes past 3:45. All in a pocket watch. So John told me this story. Here's, to the best of my recollection, the story. John's father was in Switzerland and was interested in getting John an unusual watch. And he went to one of the famous Swiss watch factories, Gerard Perregaux. I forget the name of the company, but in any case. And he couldn't quite come to a conclusion as to what this watch would be. So the agreement that was worked out is the watchmaker would take his watchmaking machine shop, which fit in a suitcase because cutting gears and things for watches were small, to John Cocke's father's home, and would make the watch there. And the story is that this took 6 months or so, and at the end of that time there was this pocket watch, a very unique thing. And John had it. So I thought that was an interesting story of how the watch got made. And John showed this off, but it was almost too good a gadget to just go hanging around. The next story I got from John about the pocket watch is he was in San Francisco, and he wandered into a jewelry shop or a watch place and said, "I got a watch that needs to be cleaned. Can you clean it?" And the guy said, "Sure, I can." You know, in those days, watches were all the wind-up kind, and you had them cleaned once in a while, and they would charge you $5 or $10. Okay, you have to put this in perspective. I would say there's at least a 10-to-1 difference in what $1 is. So then John said his idea was that this person should be faked out by getting this impossible watch, pocket watch. But the guy evidently wasn't faked out, and that was the point of John's story, is that John came back and said, "Did you clean the watch?" And the guy says, "Yep, here it is, it's cleaned." And the bill was $400, which in those days you could buy, probably one of the fanciest watches that wasn't covered with diamonds for that much money. So John told that story, and the context is that he was sure he would fake this guy out, but in turn he got faked out instead, because the guy didn't hesitate or do anything, he just cleaned it. So that was another story. One of the things that John and I have in common is that we're interested in flying. I'm more interested in flying than John is, perhaps, but he's always been interested in airplanes and in flying, and we have a lot of pilot friends in common that range from John McCone or Tom Watson Jr., people like that, who are also interested a lot in flying. And I've got lots of flying stories, if I can remember some. For example, in, let me think when this was. It's hard to remember. It was in the early 70s or late 60s. Might have been the late 60s, actually. I was out in LA for some reason, and John was around, and we decided we would go flying to Catalina. And what I remember about this is we rented an airplane from Santa Monica Airport, and I flew it out to Catalina. But when we got to Catalina, we could see the airport, but there was a low cloud over the airport, and the airport's up on a mountain. So we could see it, we could talk to the tower, but we weren't allowed to land there. So we think, okay, what next? So John said, let's go to Palm Springs. So we turned around and flew over to Palm Springs, and we decided we'd go swimming in Palm Springs. And we had a wonderful adventure because since everybody has a swimming pool in Palm Springs, there's no need for a municipal swimming pool or a public swimming pool because every house has one. So suddenly we were totally stymied and we had to solve this problem. We managed to find a hotel that would let us use their swimming pool. But John just enjoyed life, and whatever happened, it was always turned into something fun and interesting. And even though our original plan was kind of spoiled by the weather, it worked out really nice. And there have been many times that various people there's a group of people which would sort of include someone like John McCarthy or Marv Minsky or Jack Schwartz and John Cocke, all of whom are interested in computers and so on. And we would find ourselves together at times, many years ago. And what would happen, and this is a strange thing, which is that often I would hear John Cocke telling a story, and it would be like I'm hearing the story for the first time, and then I would realize, gee, he's telling a story about something that happened and I was there. And a lot of things that I remember now that are firmly in my mind are because the events happened and made no impression on me at all. And then when I heard John telling someone else the story when I'm around, it made a very big impression because his observation of it was so clear and to the point. I'll give you an example. He and I, Jack Schwartz, and a couple of other people, I think John McCarthy and Marv Minsky, some combination like that, we're flying in an airplane. I'm the pilot, and we're flying over Yosemite. And what happened is, as we're flying around, Yosemite is a very unusual thing. It's a valley, and it's big, and you can fly down in the valley. So with lots of room, and it's perfectly legal. At least it was then. I don't know if it still is. I used to fly inside the Grand Canyon. They've made that illegal recently. So in any case, we're flying along, and there's Half Dome. It's a gigantic rock, maybe 3,000 feet high, and half of it is sort of cleaved off. And as I'm flying around, I'm heading towards it more or less and about to turn. I'm a very cautious pilot. I would never do anything dangerous or something. But suddenly, Jack Schwartz was seized with a panic. We've got to get out of here fast. Get out of here, you know. And so, I turned the plane and we climbed out of there. And I never thought much about that. And there's a funny thing that happened after that. But this sticks in my mind because of my hearing John Cocke tell this story to someone else. John asked Jack, what was the matter? Were you afraid of our crashing into Half Dome? And Jack said, no, I wasn't so much afraid of crashing into Half Dome. I was afraid of being killed by the fall after we crashed into Half Dome. In other words, he had this image of bumping into this thing way up here and falling down to the bottom, which was kind of funny. So this sort of experience, which is, to me, I can't associate with any other person in the world, which is I'm full of memories which are of events because John Cocke told someone else about them while I was listening, but I happened to be there at the time. I could tell you about another one that's just like that. Something I had completely forgotten about. We were with some people, and John was telling them a story about my son, Michael. And what had happened is that we were all down at an island in the Caribbean, and I had a Hobie cat down there. This is a very fast catamaran sailing boat. And we went out I took a bunch of kids out. And I think there were 5 children and myself out on this Hobie cat, including my son and 2 daughters and Henry and Julie Minsky, Marv Minsky's 2 kids. And we're zipping along like crazy, and the boat caught a wave with the bow, and over it went. Sort of the whole rear of the boat just lifted up into the air like that, and over we went. We were all dumped into the water every which way. Everyone was a good swimmer, and we all sort of came up on the right side of the boat, and we waved to people on shore, and someone came out in an outboard and rescued us all, and then we got the boat turned over and so on. Well, in this process, I was wearing sunglasses, and they fell off in the water there. And I thought, well, it's too bad I've lost my sunglasses. So we came back. John Cocke was around watching all this. And my son Michael said, I'd like to take the dinghy and go out and look for your glasses. And I said, that's useless. Don't even try, because it's, you know, all we know is it happens somewheres out there. There's no landmark in the middle of this big sound. It's just a big body of water. You can't get back to the same place. So when someone loses, I explained patiently to my son that when someone loses something like glasses in the middle of somewheres, there's no possibility of finding it, because it, you know, the area is so big and the water is so deep you can't see it from the surface and so on, and so just forget about it. Well, what happened is, without telling me, my son went out there with a dinghy, and about 4 hours later he returned with my glasses. And this made a really big impression on John Cocke, and it probably should have on me, but I have to say in all honesty that I tell this story because I remember John telling it to someone else when I was around. I know that John used to go up to Sugarbush fairly often. He had a house there, and there's some fun stories about the house. And he'd invite us to come up and stay at the house and to ski in Sugarbush. And John is the type who, sort of impression I have, what he liked to do is go up on these expert trails, come bombing down the mountain like a demon, that kind of thing. And it was a kind of fun experience back then. That particular area had a lot of interesting people, and so it's funny, what pops into my mind is a story about the hot water heater in this.
Can we get the chair?
Yeah, right. You got the wrong end of the dog here. Okay, come here. Dog, you've got to learn camera presence. There, okay. Okay. So, there's an interesting thing. We were talking about skiing and staying in John Cocke's house, and what I remember mostly is the hot water heater, and that this house had a recalcitrant gas hot water heater. So when you came up from wherever, when you came up from Yorktown to go to Vermont, the first thing one would have to do was to light the hot water heater. And for some reason, John could not, for the life of him, light this hot water heater. I don't know what it was, but it was one of these almost impossible things. There'd be a huge pile of matches there and so on. So the one thing I could do when I would come up was light his hot water heater for him. But there's a kind of zest for life that John had that showed up in his going to Vermont and in his skiing and in his stories and so on. It's just that he has a great feeling as to how wonderful things are, how fantastic the things you see, the fun you can have, and the experiences you can have. And that's really a very unusual part of him, that his just exuberance at the wonder of being in this world and so on. Obviously, John's professional field is computer architecture. And in that field, he's had many of the key ideas that have either allowed one to get more performance from the hardware, or to reduce the cost. These are the two big things in computers. The progress made by computers is always phenomenal, and we're always getting more performance per dollar, and just those two ways at it. One of the things about John is that he can often think up ideas that are more complex than other people would think up, but those ideas actually work. An example is that back in the days when they were doing the stretch computer, there was a problem that came up, which was that the memory couldn't be made fast enough to keep up with the hardware. And so here you had a design that was supposed to be a supercomputer of sorts, and there was a problem, which is that the memory wasn't fast enough. And I remember in the early days of that project, they had ideas for various complex forms of core memory with maybe 2 holes per core and various DC biasing lines and so on, that they hoped would yield a faster memory. But that didn't happen. So the question is, what's to be done? Because it's as though you have a giant machine and all the pieces are working right, except because of problems here, the whole machine is going to run too slow. So what was needed was an invention that could somehow make the computer feel it had a faster memory, even though it didn't. I think John really came to the rescue there and thought of, I guess it was called Look Ahead or something like that at the time. And my recollection at that time was that John was kind of the master of complexity in the hardware, and that he would think of hardware solutions that and think of them in the detail that could allow them to be implemented and made to work, even though they were very complex. And that came up in both things like the look ahead or things like trying to get arithmetic units to run faster and so on. And that he got a big thrill out of, say, a very advanced circuit that used special techniques to be able to multiply or divide much faster than other people had done. So there's two kinds of aspects to it. One is John could be a fireman and show up when there was a fire of some sort and think of a solution to put the fire out. And I think that's a lot of what happened with Stretch. On the other hand, I think with the RISC architecture in the 801, this was clearly just a case of his putting a bunch of disparate facts together, bringing together a bunch of ideas and saying, hey, if we do this in this way, that's a winner. And it had a lot to do with how many, the nature of how many pieces of logic you could put on a single chip. And it had to do with the fact that letting a simple instruction set run directly out of memory worked fine for the PDP-1, remembering that. It was so simple it didn't even have a multiply or divide instruction. I remember him being impressed by that at the time. And he put all these things together and had a vision of something that could be a great way to build high-performance machines less expensively. And of course, he sort of revolutionized the whole field of what might be called really the medium performance field. It's the workstation field and things like that. But it's really, these machines are not the highest performance machines, but they're represent, you know, the great bulk of things in the 10 to 20 MIPS region, which is pretty high performance. So he has a vision of how to put these pieces together, and to me, that's more important than his being the guy who comes and solves a problem that's got you stymied or something. It's that vision of what could be and then making it happen. The other aspect is this, that I have to admire in John a lot, which is that from the time he had that concept until today, where you have the 6,000 out in the world, that's a very long time. And one of the things John has is he's had a lot of patience and endurance, and he's stuck to it, and he's seen the idea through a lot of difficult phases and so on, and IBM's gone right along with him. And you know, it's quite remarkable to have this very beautiful machine today that has a kind of checkered past in some sense, where it had the right architectural ideas, but the early implementations hadn't caught on as they should have, because they really didn't take advantage of the potential performance that might have been there, and so they were always behind on what might be called the performance curve compared to the competition, and never quite clicked. But now it suddenly looks like this thing has leapt out into the lead, and I know that John has been working on and thinking about that whole thing, this whole long time period, and that's an amazing amount of sticking to it, which is important, along with having ideas. Another thing about John, he's terribly interested in bright people. He would often call me in the same way he would call me to talk about a technical idea, to tell me about some guy who showed up at IBM Research. And he'd just talk for maybe an hour about this guy, how he'd done such and such, and he'd proved this important theorem in mathematics, and he'd be so enthusiastic about that person. And that, that became a two-way street. For instance, I remember once I had a very bright student at MIT who got interested in computers, and the question is, where here's a guy who's just brilliant, was a Rhodes Scholar, got a PhD in physics, but was interested in computers. And so I called John up, and the guy went to work for John. Unfortunately, he left and started a company with some friends called MIPS, which may have made John mad, I don't know. But basically, John is a place where a bright person can be appreciated. And so to me, John is far more than a computer architect. He's one of the most unusual people I have ever met in my life, and his sort of understanding of human, emotional, and social, if you like, needs, I think is far greater than most people would imagine, because he's almost always immersed in the technical and so on. But I see him as someone who's really very much keyed into people and to what they might, I don't know, need to find their own niche. And so I've always been on the periphery, never worked with him actually, like at IBM or anything. Well, to me, the rarest thing about John, the most unusual thing, is the sort of combination of his intellectual strengths and his observations and appreciation for people and what they are, and his willingness to go out on a limb based on something that he feels is right. It's a credit, I also have to say, I always think of it as a credit to IBM to recognize John for what a great guy he is, and they did that early on. And I think, you know, they maybe thought of him, in my opinion, as here's a guy who, you know, saved the stretch or something like that. But he's had the support to be able to make IBM do things that were good for IBM to do. I think that that's one of the, it's been a great relationship between the two.
I'm finished on my side. If there's anything else that you